Imagine this, a dark street, a cold wind, and only one street light blinking dimly against the almost complete silence. Suddenly, a gunshot shatters the peace of the night. The policeman, whose face is hidden under the shadows, looks at the defenseless animal, at the kind and loyal dog, which just a moment ago was happily looking at its master. And this shot was no accident. Friends, this video is about a story that gives you goosebumps, a story that reveals the darkest corners of the human soul. We analyze this case, which caused a storm of emotions in thousands of people. Write in the comments your name and city where you watch us from. You can't imagine how important it is for us. Your comments help to promote our channel, make us stronger and closer to you. We appreciate each of you, and we are thankful that you are with us. The support from viewers like you inspires us to work even harder. Enjoy the show. The sound of footsteps echoed softly in the dark street, covered in thick shadows from the sparse, faintly glowing lanterns. The late evening was almost silent. Only a light wind rustled among the fallen leaves, stirring up the cold, damp air. The black man walked with his favorite dog, a Labrador with shiny black fur that followed faithfully beside him. The time was late, and the city seemed to stand still, hushed in deafening silence. He always went out at this time, when the streets were empty and nothing threatened him. Today the man especially enjoyed the rare freedom. There was not a soul around, and only his dog broke the silence by stomping beside him. The man loved these walks, when the whole world seemed to belong to the two of them. But something was beginning to stir a vague uneasiness in him. A sudden sense of unease made him stop and look around. There was a low rustling sound, as if someone was watching him from around the corner. The Labrador growled, wary, and looked toward the nearest streetlight, where the shadows seemed thicker than usual. The man forced himself to grin, pushing the panic away. What could possibly happen out here on an empty street? He mentally tried to reassure himself, but the feeling of unease didn't go away, and he looked around again, clutching the leash a little tighter, as if hoping his faithful friend would help him ward off the strange premonition. At that moment, he saw a dark figure slowly emerge from the shadows. A tall man in a police uniform with a cold, assessing gaze. The policeman's dry, confident footsteps seemed to cut through the night air like a blade. There was something menacing about his figure that immediately made the man tense. His heart pounded faster, and the dog's fur lifted, giving away his anxiety. The policeman stopped a few steps away from him, silently and carefully studying the man and the dog. There was something frightening, almost hard in his eyes, as if he were not a man with a dog, but a dangerous criminal. The man shuddered faintly at the look. Somehow he felt at once that something was going wrong. And then a dry voice cut through the silence. "Hey, you." The voice sounded like a sharp order, imbued with a tension that was felt in every sound. The man felt goosebumps run up his spine, and the dog growled, clinging to his master. An ominous, oppressive atmosphere hung in the air at once. The police patrol drove slowly, the car's headlights illuminating the empty street, piercing through the fog that seemed to billow just above the pavement. Behind the wheel sat an officer with a frown, his eyes gliding over the street, searching for any sign of suspicious behavior. Suddenly he spotted a silhouette, a lone black man with a dog, walking leisurely along the sidewalk. The officer squinted his eyes, a slight grin on his face, full of contempt, suppressing an incomprehensible irritation. He swerved the car to the curb, as if he already felt he had every right to control this man. In his mind, this wasn't just a passerby, this was a problem type. Without reason, without any evidence, the officers instantly labeled the man dangerous. As he got out of the car, he squinted at the man, his gaze sliding over the passerby's appearance, his clothes, his gait, even the dog that walked beside him, as if it all confirmed his basis stereotypes. The policeman was sure that a black man on a night street with a dog was not just a random person, but a potential threat that needed to be dealt with. As the officers came closer, his posture became even more tense. His face cold and stern, he made no attempt to hide the contempt that was in his every movement, as if this man did not deserve even ordinary human respect. His eyes narrowed, studying the man as if he were not a human being, but an object that could be examined, tested, evaluated, and even, if necessary, suppressed without hesitation. "You," the officers pointed his hand at the man, his voice icy and curt. "What are you doing here?" The question sounded almost like an accusation. He wasn't just asking, he already suspected. The man felt fear and confusion under the officer's gaze, but he tried not to show his emotions. Memories of how often he'd been subjected to prejudice stares came flooding back, and he tried to suppress his irritation. He already knew that look judgmental, demeaning, belittling. It was a look that let him know, you don't belong here. You're under suspicion simply because you're here, and because of who you are. The policeman took a step closer, eyeing his dog with frank contempt, as if the animal also deserved his wrath simply because it belonged to this man. The man held the leash carefully, hesitating to make an extra movement, his heart beating faster. Dogs had always been to him a symbol of freedom, of loyalty. They never judged by the color of their skin. But now, even his four-legged friend seemed defenseless to this gaze. "Do you have any documents?" the officers demanded coldly, breaking the silence and ignoring any decorum. The words sounded with a tinge of disgust, as if the man was obliged to justify his existence in advance. It was as if the policeman was enjoying how easily he could exercise his power at this moment. He didn't need justification. He didn't need a real reason. As one look, full of contempt, was enough to make him feel right. At this moment, with bitter mockery including in his soul, the officers felt himself at the pinnacle of power over this suspicious type, and this power seemed only to fuel in him a deep sense of superiority and hatred. The policeman stood opposite the man, arms crossed over his chest, his posture radiating obvious displeasure and weariness. He looked at the man as if he already knew that he was looking at someone who could cause trouble. That look was drenched in latent aggression, prejudice, and a sense of his own power. The suspicions that flashed in the officer's eyes were unfounded and absurd, but his prejudiced perception left the man no chance for fair treatment. The policeman stared intently into the passerby's face, as if searching for the slightest sign of guilt in his gaze. Every movement of the man, every gesture, even the calmest and most natural, the officers perceived as a possible threat, preparing to suppress it instantly if necessary. His face expressed a mixture of contempt and rejection, as if he did not need an excuse to feel entitled to control, subjugate, and humiliate. "You look strange here," the officer said with an icy tone, pressing his lips together and scrutinizing the man from head to toe. "At a time like this, with a dog, and alone. Strange, you know." His words, spoken with unmistakable contempt, sounded like an accusation. The officer was examining the dog, as if its behavior could be a confirmation of his far-fetched threat. It was as if he was waiting for the animal to show aggression, which would give him an excuse to act harshly. Even the silence that enveloped the street only added to the poignancy of the moment, as if the night itself held its breath, waiting for something bad to happen. The man, feeling the officer's penetrating gaze, kept himself calm, but fear was growing inside him. He saw the officers literally looking for a reason for conflict, his eyes glowing with hidden anger and a desire to subdue, to show his superiority. His whole appearance and behavior said he did not want an answer, but an opportunity to assert his power. Although he did not see any threat in the man's behavior, the policeman still internally convinced himself that he was facing a potential problem. At some point, as if deciding that he had found what he was looking for, the officer stepped closer, reducing the distance to a minimum, as if intentionally testing the man's stamina. "You even have permission to walk your dog here?" His voice was full of hidden menace, spoken with a venomous sneer, as if he already knew what to say in case of any attempt to object. The man tried to calmly explain that he lived in the neighborhood and regularly walked his dog here, but the officers grinned incredulously. As if it were a deliberate lie, the officer's eyes showed a clear intent to humiliate, to show that he did not believe a single word the man said. "So you live here?" The policeman stared into his face. His eyes narrowed, and his voice became even more harsh and hard. "Doesn't look like it. In fact, I don't know what you're trying to do, but I don't like it." Now the man felt the fear change to panic. He realized that the policeman had not come here to check his papers or to make sure everything was all right. He was looking for a reason to stop him, to take out his irritation and prejudice on him. The policeman, arms crossed over his chest, barely containing a sarcastic grin, continued to scrutinize the man standing in front of him with a dog. The officer's gaze was full of contempt, and it made the tension in the air almost palpable. It was as if he was deliberately emphasizing his authority. making the man feel increasingly uncomfortable. The man knew he was in a vulnerable position, but he tried to remain calm, even though his insides were clenching with fear and resentment. The policeman took another step closer, deliberately invading the man's personal space. He spoke in a cold, haughty tone, his every word imbued with hidden contempt. "You know," the officer said with a sneer in his voice, "you don't exactly look like the kind of person who should be walking these streets. You ought to get away from here, don't you think?" The man remained silent, feeling the tension gripping him, but the officers only increased the pressure. Deliberately provoking, he glanced at the dog that stood next to his master and snorted with obvious disdain. "What's that? A dog? It can't be called a dog. It's a strange sight." His voice was full of anger and outright mockery. "You and that animal don't fit in at all. You know, people like you don't belong here, especially with such cats." The policeman deliberately played on stereotypes, throwing derogatory phrases with the obvious purpose of insulting and humiliating. He savored every word, as if deliberately choosing them to hurt the man more deeply. His gaze was icy and hostile, and every gesture emphasized a dislike he did not hide. The officers enjoyed the way his words made the man feel humiliated, made him feel threatened, and, by all accounts, it amused him. "I'm sure you realize you're not exactly welcome here," he continued, his voice even more sarcastic. "You bring your beasts here and you think you own the place. If I were you, I'd think twice before hanging around here at this hour." The man clenched his hands into fists, struggling to hold back the emotions that were rushing out. Every word the policeman said was a painful jab, and he felt himself pressed against a wall from which there was no escape. But the policeman was clearly not going to stop. He came even closer, standing right up to him, leaning in so that his face was a few centimeters from the man's. "You must realize you won't be here long," he whispered with a hoarse chuckle. "People like you always bring trouble. If I wanted to, you'd be on your knees begging to get out of here." He paused, savoring the fear he knew the man felt. The policeman had been waiting for this moment, as if his irritation had turned into some grim satisfaction at the realization of his power. The man was like a hunted animal, intimidated and humiliated, but the policeman continued to press him with even more force. "Consider it a favor that you're not still in handcuffs," the officer said, enjoying every word. "But you don't have to thank me. You hang around here too much, and I'll make sure you and your dog don't come back here again." The whole scene was designed to humiliate and break the man, to make him feel completely helpless. The policeman noticed the dog growling, looking at him warily. His ears pressed back, the Labrador, as if sensing his master's tension, began to shift restlessly from paw to paw, protecting him with his body and casting warning glances in the officer's direction. This irritated the policeman. In his eyes, a dog that showed even the slightest aggression would immediately become a threat and, of course, a problem that needs to be solved immediately. The policeman looked at the dog with demonstrative contempt, then leaned closer, taking a step toward it. His lips curled into a malicious grin, and he said with a venomous sneer, "Oh, you brought your doggy here, too. You think he can protect you, or are you trying to sick him on me?" He took another step, provoking the animal. The policeman's words sounded threatening, and there was no hint of sympathy or understanding in his tone, only hostility. The dog stood up warily, lowering its muzzle and growling quietly, trying to understand the stranger's intentions. The man, sensing that the situation was escalating, pulled the leash to keep the dog close, but this only made the policeman more agitated. "What? The dog doesn't want to listen to you anymore," he grinned, looking straight into the animal's eyes. "That's okay. Just one move from me is enough to calm it down." He took hold of his belt, where the flashlight was hanging, and suddenly waved it sharply in front of the dog's face, as if he wanted to provoke it to aggression. The Labrador growled louder, but did not rush forward. He was ready to defend his master, but remained in place. The policeman grinned, his eyes glittering with cold malice. "Yeah, good doggy. Growl, growl, but you know what?" He squinted, as if addressing the animal itself. "One more growl like that, and I'll have every right to get you out of my way. You think anyone's gonna stop me?" The man felt his anger boiling inside him, but he realized that any sudden movement would only worsen the situation. As if sensing his helplessness, the policeman turned to him and added mockingly, Look, if your dog tries anything, he deliberately raised his hand to show me his gun holster, I'll shoot him right away, believe me. I won't even blink an eye. It was as if the policeman was waiting for the dog to rush forward, for a single misstep to be the occasion. For an immediate and brutal response, he was deliberately increasing the tension, holding his hand close to the weapon, so that the man could see it, so that he would know that at any second it might become a reality. Do you realize that you are keeping a dangerous animal here? He went on, his voice full of aggression. Or do you like playing with fire so much? With every word, the policeman seemed to be demonstratively showing that his power extended not only to the man, but also to his beloved dog. He made the man realize that he had no control, that the only thing his dog was worth to the policeman was another reason to show his power. For the last time, he grinned, looking at the man with an icy stare. If your muck growls again, I'll deal with it in a way you won't have time to regret. The policeman stood directly in front of the man, looking at him with an expression of haughty superiority. In his eyes was the absolute certainty of his authority and the fact that he was allowed to say and do whatever he wanted. The words he spoke were soaked with contempt, and every phrase was intended to humiliate, to strip the man of his dignity and make him feel like an outsider. Do you even realize where you are? The officers grinned, looking at the man from head to toe, as if he saw him not as a human being but as something unworthy of respect. You think you're welcome here. People like you shouldn't be walking these streets. His voice was low and hoarse, and there was a tinge of malicious mockery in it, as if the man were unworthy of even the usual treatment. The officers leaned closer, again invading personal space, making his words penetrate deeper, and, lowering his voice, said with contempt, I keep my head down. If I were you, isn't there a better place for guys like you? Yeah, and you brought your tail here. He waved his hand at the dog, emphasizing that he had nothing but contempt for the animal and its owner. The man stood silent, but resentment and pain bubbled up inside him. He had encountered such attitudes many times before, but each such encounter left new wounds. The policeman, as if sensing his inner tension, grinned, enjoying the moment and knowing that his words were hitting him where it hurt. Do you think you have any rights here? The policeman laughed, his laugh dry, angry. You're in a foreign place. You understand. No one expects you here or wants you here. This ain't no neighborhood for your breed. He said the last word with an obvious sneer, as if the man were something beneath him, someone who could never rise to his level. He deliberately used that expression, deliberately humiliating the man, emphasizing his status as an outsider who had no place in his world. It's funny that you act like you have a right to be here. He continued with a wry smile. Come to think of it, what else do you have to do? It's all you've got, isn't it? These dirty streets you litter with your presence. Well, tell me, who are you to walk around here amongst normal people? His every word was carefully chosen to insult, to humiliate, to show that a man had no place here. He spoke with such ease, with such casualness, as if insults were a familiar thing to him, something ordinary and even natural. The words were spoken with contempt, as if the officers enjoyed the way his humiliating phrases made the man feel helpless and vulnerable. You have no idea how tired we are of people like you, he added, taking a step back, but not removing the contempt from his face. Seriously, you'd better realize that you're not welcome here. The policeman suddenly changed his tone. His voice became louder and sharper, cutting through the silence of the night like a cold scream in the dark. The man felt a chill run down his spine as the officers assumed an even more threatening posture, flashing his eyes with the same coldness and rejection as if he were looking at an enemy. I'm warning you, the policeman shouted, his voice hard and threateningly rough. Give me the slightest excuse, and I'll deal with you and your dog once and for all. You think you can walk around here with impunity? You think I don't know you're up to something? The dog, alerted by the cry, growled softly, barely audible, as if instinctively sensing the danger hanging over its master. The man, clutching the leash with a trembling hand, looked pleadingly at the officers, trying to remain calm, but fear was breaking through his eyes. He realized that the officers was looking for an excuse, any excuse, to use force, to unleash his tension on him and his dog. Please, the man's voice was quiet and worried. We're just taking a walk. We haven't done anything wrong. I'm begging you, leave us alone. But the policeman did not seem to hear him. His gaze was fixed on the dog, and something sinister, almost satisfied, flashed in his eyes. He enjoyed the way the man begged for mercy, the way fear made him speak carefully and quietly, the way in every movement of the dog and his master, he knew they were in the crosshairs of his threats. "Your dog's got a lot on his plate," he said as he continued to stare at the wary animal. "You think you can hold him if he comes at me? I'd take him down with one shot without even thinking about it." The man frowned, his heart pounding in his chest, and he tried again to calm the policeman. Feeling the fear literally paralyzing him, he knew that any attempt to object, any response could only make the situation worse. But the officers, not listening to him, went on the offensive with a wild, almost sadistic pleasure. "I have every right to defend myself. Understand?" he shouted, taking another step closer and bringing his hand closer to the holstered weapon. "And if your dog makes a move, I'll shoot him where he stands, and no one will be able to charge me with anything. Nobody makes a peep. You understand?" The man felt a lump come up in his throat, and his voice broke as he tried to answer. He saw the officers in front of him, his face twisted with anger, saw how he clearly enjoyed his power and impunity, his right to decide fates, to deprive anyone of peace and safety. Please, we'll just leave. Okay, we'll just leave and never come back here," the man whispered softly, his voice shaking with suppressed terror. The policeman stood still, not taking his eyes off the man, savoring this moment, absorbing the fear he was instilling in the man and his dog. It was as if he were slowly savoring each moment, letting the fear intensify, turning into a chilling terror in which the man was afraid to even breathe. The night Frouncy plunged into a frightening silence, in which every sound seemed to become unbearably loud. The man stood, trying to remain calm, but his heart was pounding and his hands were trembling, clutching the leash. The dog, sensing his master's tension, stood close by, watching the policeman. Like the man, it was wary, but ready to protect the man it had trusted all its life. The policeman, seeing the fear in the man's eyes and the dog's tension, seemed to revel in the moment. His hand slid slowly to the holster, and a grim, almost sadistic grin appeared on his face. The man saw the movement and felt everything inside him clench with terror. Instinctively, he stepped closer to the dog, as if hoping that his presence might protect him from the impending disaster. "Please don't do this," he said, his voice almost a whisper, but the words were all helplessness and despair. "She didn't do anything wrong. Just let us go." But the policeman did not listen. His eyes narrowed, his gaze remained cold and cruel, devoid of the slightest compassion. It was as if he had made up his mind and was going to carry it out without the slightest doubt. At that moment, his fingers frowned on the pistol. With agonizing slowness, he drew the weapon, pointing it directly at the dog. The man frowned in horror, his heart beating so loudly that he could barely hear his own thoughts. He felt everything around him become shaky, the fear gripping his body, making it impossible for him to move. The dog, strangely enough, looked at the policeman without aggression, ready to protect, but without threat. It just stood by its master's side, faithful and loyal to the end, not realizing the danger it was in. Suddenly, there was a deafening gunshot. The rumble tore the silence of the night like an explosion, piercing the silence, echoing, hitting his ears, and shattering the calm around him. The man felt the world collapse in an instant. His dog made a short, drawn-out sound, like a sob, and then her body collapsed to the pavement. A dark pool of blood formed where she had been standing, spraying quickly across the cold asphalt. The man cried out, but the sound of his voice was drowned in the silence of the night, mingled with a desperate, heart-wrenching cry of pain and terror. He knelt down in front of the dog, his hands, trembling and cold, pressed against his soft fur, which was instantly warm with blood. He tried to find any sign of life, tried to hold her here beside him, but he knew it was over. In an instant, his faithful friend, his only protector, had been brutally murdered before his eyes. The policeman, still holding his gun at the ready, watched the scene with a cold, detached expression, without the slightest sign of regret or shame. He looked at the man as if he were a captured beast, broken, destroyed, and the sight seemed to give him a strange, sinister satisfaction. The man sobbed, hugging the lifeless body of his friend, feeling the cold darkness engulf him, knowing that this brutal, senseless violence would forever remain in his heart. The man knelt, cradling the lifeless body of his dog, and felt the world around him suddenly lose shape and meaning. Everything that had gone before the evening walk, The quiet, peaceful neighborhood, even life itself had all shattered. It was as if he were in a nightmare from which he could not escape, an endless horror where time had stopped and reality had lost touch with his understanding. His hands, which had recently stroked the soft fur of his faithful friend, were now clutching his body, which was growing colder by the second. He could feel the dog's blood, still warm, bouncing through his fingers and staining his clothes. The smell of iron and damp asphalt mingled into one unbearably pungent odor that was absorbed into his memory and left an indelible mark on his soul. The man tried to find words, but his voice wouldn't listen to him. His mouth was dry, and even his breathing became ragged and hoarse. He looked at the dog, into that empty, glassy eyes that had once been full of life and devotion, and could not believe what was happening. How could it be that his faithful friend was gone? That just one cruel moment had shattered their bond, torn what had seemed unbreakable. His eyes were wide open, his gaze frowning and devastated. He seemed to stare straight ahead, but saw nothing around him. It was as if the world had faded, the sounds had dissolved, and he was left alone with his despair. He tried to understand how something like this could have happened, how someone in uniform, a representative of the law, could so brutally and senselessly take the life of his only friend. His thoughts were stuck on the question, as if he were searching for even a hint of an answer in the absolute silence. But he found nothing. His hands began to tremble more violently, and he ran them, almost unconsciously, over the dog's fur, as if he were trying to warm it, to bring it back, to give it another moment by his side. But the cold reality sank into his consciousness with inexorable force. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and he surrendered to those sobs, burying his face in the dog's neck as he had once done when he'd sought comfort in it. There was no one around to support him now, no one to come to his aid. The policeman was already gone, leaving him alone with his grief, as if everything that had happened didn't matter. The world around him remained indifferent to his pain. In that moment, he felt infinitely alone and helpless, broken and devastated, as if he had lost not only a friend but a part of himself. His heart was broken, and it seemed to him that this wound could not be healed by anything. The silence enveloping the street was interrupted by muffled cries and whispers. People, attracted by the sound of the gunshot, began to come out of their houses and come closer, some running out into the street, looking around for the source of the noise. At first, it was only a few people, but soon they were outnumbered neighbors, random passers-by. Anyone who happened to be nearby came to see what had happened. They frowned with horror and incomprehension in their eyes as they saw a man kneeling beside the body of his dog, his face contorted with pain and despair. "Oh my God, what happened here?" the woman whispered, pressing her palm to her mouth. She looked at the man and his dog with an expression of absolute horror, her eyes glistening with held-back tears. Her voice trembled, as if she were experiencing it with him. "It was his dog," said someone in the crowd, and the whisper spread like a wave among the people, increasing their indignation. Everyone present was shocked. What had happened was so inhuman and terrible that it seemed untrue, some cruel fantasy that could not be realized in reality. Many of those gathered stood, unable to believe that a police officer could do such a thing, whether they could understand or justify such senseless cruelty. Some pulled out their phones, pointing their cameras at the police officers, at the man still cradling the dog's body, and at the spot where the dark pool of blood was spraying. They knew they had to film it, to preserve the evidence, to show the world this injustice. "Hey, he shot the dog," a young man exclaimed, filming on his phone, his voice full of indignation. He could not believe his eyes and did not hold back his emotions, addressing his shout to the policeman, who was standing nearby, keeping a cold expression on his face. "Why, how can you do this?" Voices were heard from the crowd. The people looking at the grieving man felt deep indignation and incomprehension. They were shocked that the cruelty was so openly and seemingly without reason. Their faces reflected anger, tears, helplessness, and rage mixed into one feeling as they realized they had witnessed something so monstrous that reason refused to accept it. The crowd gradually began to put pressure on the policeman. Their whispers and exclamations grew louder. Restless emotion morphed into open condemnation and indignation. Someone shouted, "What? You think we're gonna let this go? This is insane." The policeman cast a quick glance at the crowd. His face remained cold, but there was a slight worry in his eyes. He clearly hadn't expected so many people to witness his act. but it tried to maintain control. However, the crowd began to crowd around him. Their phones pointed at him like silent accusations, and every person here was becoming a living witness to his actions. More and more voices merged into a rumble of condemnation and rage, each trying to express their indignation, directing their eyes at the man who had lost his friend and the policeman, who everyone here thought had done something that was unjustifiable. A video capturing the tragic moment quickly went viral on the internet. The recording, made by the trembling hands of an eyewitness, began with the agonizing scream of a man kneeling next to the body of his dead dog. A police officer could be seen in the frame, standing nearby with a gun in his hands, his face seemingly indifferent and unconcerned with the suffering he had just caused. The camera zoomed in on the pool of blood on the pavement, then focused again on the man whose sobs and despair could not be ignored. Anyone who watched the video could feel this grief, soaked in pain and powerlessness. The caption under the video was brief but evocative. A police officer killed a dog in cold blood. The video was accompanied by dozens of comments, which began to appear almost immediately after publication. The feed was filled with outraged remarks, each new comment reflecting a growing sense of horror, fear and bewilderment at what brutal authorities can do. "How can you be so cruel? This man has no right to a uniform," wrote one user, his words gaining thousands of likes in a matter of minutes. "It's not the police, it's a monster in uniform." Another was indignant. "Where is justice? Why is he still at large?" The video continued to be forwarded, and it quickly went viral on social media. The posts multiplied, and the comments became increasingly angry, furious and full of indignation. Users wrote that they felt a chill on their skin when they saw how easily a man dressed in a police uniform decided to commit such a cruel act. Each comment expressed pain and sympathy for the man who had lost his loyal friend, and rage at the policeman, whose face was now becoming a symbol of indifference and evil. "This is not just the killing of a dog, this is callousness and cruelty to which we are all now vulnerable," wrote a woman, whose comment came to symbolize the collective fear that pierced the community in the wake of the story. "If this can happen to his dog, what's to stop him from doing the same to a human?" wondered another user. These words were echoed by thousands of others who saw the incident not only as a tragedy, but also as a threat to all those who had hoped for protection from the law. Users post footage of the video, adding it to their posts with the hashtags #JusticeForDogs and Stop Cruelty. The texts were accompanied by calls to hold the police officers accountable, to remove him from service, to reform the system that allowed such a person to put on a uniform and feel power over the lives of others. "We must not let this go. We will not let this be the norm." The words of the angry comment, which garnered tens of thousands of likes, became a kind of call to action, a symbol that society was not ready to accept what it saw as blatant injustice and cold cruelty. The video went viral, and each new spread only increased the general fear. People increasingly wrote that they felt vulnerable, that they were losing trust in those who were supposed to protect them. Soon after the video of the dog's tragic death circulated online, news outlets began covering the incident, focusing on the police officers' actions and their possible motivation. Articles with high-profile headlines, like "Racism in Uniform" and "Police Brutality Against the Innocent," flooded the internet. Journalists did not just report on what happened, but also raised questions about what influenced the officer's behavior. The articles clearly analyzed his actions, each of which readers saw as a manifestation of racial bias. The media reminded the public of such cases of injustice and violence, especially emphasizing that too often the victims are members of minorities. Several well-known publications published articles that did not hide their outrage. They described in detail the cruelty and humiliation that the man was subjected to in the face of the police officers. In every step of the officers, in every phrase thrown at the man, the journalists saw traces of deep, unconcealed racism, which the officers considered to be the norm, acting with a sense of impunity and absolute superiority. Opinion leaders and activists from various public organizations for human rights and against racial discrimination joined the discussion, sharpening the resonance. The posts of well-known lawyers and human rights defenders started a real wave of criticism, each post receiving tens of thousands of likes, comments, and reposts opinion leaders and activists held streamings, addressing viewers with the question, why did another case of racist cruelty go unpunished? How can we allow those who are supposed to protect us to threaten and humiliate us? Hashtags related to the case continued to gain popularity. Justice for the victims, anti-police racism, protect the innocent, calls for an investigation, demands for explanations, and the immediate suspension of the police officers grew louder and louder. Under the posts on social networks, people described their own encounters with police officers and how they, like this man, face bias from the form and power of the law. In the face of such powerful public pressure, government officials were forced to make statements. The police announced the launch of an internal investigation, promising that the incident would be thoroughly investigated. However, people did not want to believe in the objectivity of the internal investigation. They demanded justice, insisted on transparency. One after another, articles and posts came out skeptically, commenting on the police's intention to get to the bottom of it, considering it an attempt to hush up the case. Talk shows about the incident began to appear on television and social media. Each episode discussed why this case of racist aggression was possible, how the system supports such actions, and how to combat the bias and brutality that permeates the police. Prominent advocates and activists demanded that the officers be immediately suspended and prosecuted, emphasizing that this case cannot be forgiven or forgotten. A new movement against racism and police brutality swept across the country, and every day the calls for justice grew louder. People believed that if left unchecked now, unpunished brutality would be repeated again and again. The pressure was growing, and society was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to the bias and violence behind the racism, humiliation, and disregard for the lives of others. Public outrage reached its peak, and the streets of the city began to fill with people demanding justice. At first, it was small groups of activists who gathered near the police station with placards and megaphones. But after a few days, the number of participants grew tenfold. They were joined by representatives of human rights organizations, city residents, families with children, and young people. The protesters were holding pictures of the killed dog, as well as placards that read, "Justice for all. Police should not kill. No to racism in uniform." The protesters chanted slogans that echoed through the streets: "Protect us, not attack us. Justice should not depend on skin color. Police for all, not for a select few." These simple but powerful words captured the essence of their demands: the need for change, the need for reforms that would end bias and brutality. The slogans on the posters were full of anger and pain, their words directed directly at those who made the decisions. The protesters demanded that the authorities listen to the people, that police officers whose actions are based on hatred and bias can no longer go unpunished. No privileges for brutality. This slogan, written in black letters on a white banner, has come to symbolize the campaign against violence by law enforcement agencies. "Your uniform is not a right to be racist," a young woman in the crowd shouted loudly, and her words were echoed by other protesters chanting in unison. They wanted to show that the uniform a police officer wears should not justify crime and brutality, especially when it is directed against the defenseless. At one point, the crowd marched through the central streets of the city, chanting a slogan that sounded like a dire warning: "We are not afraid. We demand the truth." This call echoed in the hearts of all those who felt vulnerable to the system that was supposed to protect them. On the front line were activists with banners: "Dogs are our friends, not targets," and "Hands off the innocent." These words were particularly moving, reminding of the pain and loss the man experienced that terrible evening, and that he was not alone in his fight for justice. As the protests gained momentum, they were joined by representatives of social movements against racism and police brutality. They held placards that read, "We are all one community, rights for all." Without exception, these slogans became a symbol of unity and solidarity, reminding us that the tragedy of one man and his dog was a common pain. The voices of leaders of human rights organizations were heard on megaphones calling for action. "We will not rest until there is justice. We demand reform, transparency, and accountability in the police." These words were accompanied by loud applause, and the crowd supported everyone who stood up for the victims. Protesters organized a living corridor outside the police building, holding candles in memory of the dead dog and as a symbol of unyielding will. This silent protest was full of meaning and strength, reminding the police and authorities that their actions will be under the scrutiny of the public. As the protests intensified, old, painful stories of police brutality and racial bias began to surface. People shared their personal experiences on social media and at rallies, recounting how they, their friends or family members, had been treated unfairly by police simply because of the color of their skin. The stories were eerily similar: detentions without reason, insults, humiliation, illegal searches, threats, and even the use of force, all of which exacerbated social tensions, as if opening old, unhealed wounds. Each day, the protests became more massive and emotionally charged. Rally participants, standing on the streets with placards and megaphones, demanded not only justice for what happened to the man and his dog, but also answers to questions about systemic discrimination. People said that this case was not an exception, but only the tip of the iceberg. At the rallies, there were fierce speeches from activists and leaders of social movements who addressed the crowd with pain and anger in their voices. How much longer do we have to endure? How many more tragedies like this have to happen before we are heard? Was the voice of one of the protest leaders, and his words resonated powerfully in the hearts of all present. Social tensions also grew as people began to realize how deeply entrenched bias was in the law enforcement system. Hundreds of stories of unfair treatment flooded the internet, with people sharing videos, photos, and stories that confirmed that the police acted in a biased manner, especially against blacks and other minorities. These stories were shared, commented on, reposted, and public discontent grew into anger. Social media became a chronicle not only of this incident, but also of many incidents from the past that burned people again, reminding them that it was long past time to put an end to it. One social media user posted, "How many more cases like this have to happen before we finally see change? Why should we fear those who are supposed to protect us?" The post caused a storm of emotion and was reposted by thousands of people, each of whom understood and shared this pain. Each new case that came to the surface seemed to increase the heat and intensify the fear and outrage. Public figures, celebrities, and well-known opinion leaders joined the discussion, making posts with calls to action, demanding immediate changes from the authorities and punishment for the perpetrators. Every day, their calls grew louder and their demands more stringent. Television shows and news programs discussed systemic problems in the police force, citing heart-wrenching statistics: the percentage of excessive use of force against minorities, the proportion of unjustified detentions and discriminatory searches. Social tensions were increasing day by day, and people began to feel more and more vulnerable and undeservedly blamed. The phrase "we are tired of being afraid" was often heard at rallies. This simple call united tens of thousands of people who felt rejected and ignored in their own country. Old wounds were opening up, and society was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. With each protest, with each public statement, with each news story, it became clear that people were no longer willing to be silent and tolerant, and the pressure on the authorities grew like an approaching storm. Amid growing protests and public outrage, the police leadership finally issued an official statement, which was broadcast on television and posted on official pages in social networks. Many journalists, activists, and representatives of human rights organizations gathered in the press conference hall, expecting the police leadership to condemn the police officers' actions and announce concrete steps to solve the problem. However, the content of the statement was restrained and cautious, which only increased discontent and suspicion among the public. The chief of police, with an official and stern expression on his face, stepped to the microphones and began his speech with full expressions of condolence. "We realize that last week's incident has stirred up emotions in the community and deeply affected many. We extend our condolences to the family and friends of the victim." However, there was no sincerity in his voice, and his words seemed pre-learned. He further stated that an internal investigation was underway to establish all the facts and circumstances of the incident. The management emphasized that it was not going to draw premature conclusions and would follow all standard procedures. Words about impartiality and principled approach sounded like empty promises, while the crowd outside the building shouted slogans demanding immediate action and justice. We are conducting a thorough check to find out whether all protocols have been followed. If violations are found, appropriate measures will be taken, the police chief added. Without specifying what measures might be taken, he avoided mentioning the racist nature of the incident and did not voice any criticism of the officer's actions, which immediately triggered a wave of outrage questions from journalists. One reporter asked a pointed question: "Don't you think this officer's actions were motivated by racial bias? How are you going to prevent similar cases in the future?" The police chief responded to this question in a dry and evasive manner, stating that it was too early to draw conclusions about the officer's motivation. He noted that every police officer undergoes rigorous training and selection, and that cases of misconduct are isolated and do not reflect the general attitude of the police. His words sounded cold and detached, as if he was trying to distance himself from the tragedy, treating it as an ordinary incident, not worthy of special attention. The statement caused a wave of discontent not only among the protesters, but also on social networks. Users left comments under the press release, expressing their indignation. "Why didn't they even mention racism? This is outrageous. We demand real action, not empty words. What investigation? It's clear as day. It's racism and brutality in its purest form, and the police are getting away with it again. We will not rest until this officer is punished. Stop covering for your own." Following the statement, police also said the officers were suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. However, the lack of criticism and clear promises of reform only increased discontent. It was obvious to many that the authorities were trying to avoid responsibility by presenting what happened as an isolated incident, rather than recognizing a deeper problem. The public expected condemnation and real action, but instead they heard formal phrases that only added fuel to the fire. Many activists and opinion leaders on social media pointed out that the police statement was an attempt to stall for time, to allow public outrage to subside. Posts and publications under the hashtag #DemandJustice continued to gain popularity, with more and more people expressing frustration and distrust in a system that seemed to once again stand up for its employees in defiance of justice. This press release has come to symbolize to many that the system refuses to admit its shortcomings and is willing to protect its employees at all costs, even if it costs the public trust. After the tragic incident and outraged public demands, the police officers accused of brutality and prejudice completely disappeared from view. As if trying to erase his presence, his absence became particularly noticeable amidst the mass outrage and demands for justice. This man, on whom the public now focused its anger and frustration, made no public statements and did not appear on the screen, leaving each new accusatory comment and call for accountability without the slightest attention. The media repeatedly tried to contact the police officers for an interview to get his version of events, or at least to hear an explanation. Reporters left requests, asked questions on social media, and tried to get comments through colleagues and supervisors, but were rebuffed each time. The police officers seemed to hide behind a strong wall of silence and indifference, as if hoping that the storm would soon subside and it could be forgotten. The officer's silence caused even more indignation. People were expecting some kind of explanation, an apology, an attempt to explain his behavior, or an admission of error. However, the police officers chose the tactic of absolute ignorance. There was not a single response to press inquiries, not the slightest hint of remorse. On social media, users wrote bitterly and angrily about his behavior, calling his indifference egregious and inhumane. He doesn't even see fit to say anything, like he doesn't even care about the pain he caused, one user wrote, which gained thousands of likes. Such silence is worse than any answer. It is as if he puts himself above all of us, above law and morality, others emphasized. With each passing day, the lack of response from the policeman seemed more and more defiant. People felt not only disappointed but humiliated by his silent disregard, as if they did not deserve his response. This behavior was perceived by many as an act of contempt, as if he considered himself untouchable and unaccountable to the public, as if his status and uniform entitled him to absolute indifference. Activist communities, human rights defenders and minority representatives further escalated their statements. In their eyes, the officer's complete disregard for what was happening became a symbol of the entire system. which seemed to allow its representatives to commit egregious acts while remaining safe behind a shield of silence and internal cover. Many activists wrote that his silence was not just an avoidance of responsibility, but a manifestation of a deep-seated confidence in impunity. He doesn't even try to explain himself because he's sure no one will punish him. He doesn't see it as a problem, wrote on social media, a sentiment shared by thousands of people. Some publications, outraged by the lack of response, published articles with headlines such as "The Cop Hiding from the Truth" and "Silence as a Symbol of Impunity," directly accusing him of cowardice and disrespect for society. For many, this silence was a confirmation of his guilt and unwillingness to admit his actions, which only fueled the protests and increased the demand for immediate change. The silence of the guilty policeman became a metaphor for the whole situation. It was not just the silence of one man, but a symbol of the silence of a system that refuses to recognize the mistakes of its representatives and does not rush to protect those it is supposed to protect. The public felt that his silence shouted louder than any words, amplifying the pain and anger of people demanding justice and change in a system that seemed indifferent to the suffering of ordinary citizens. Away from the cameras and judgmental stares, the police officers accused of the brutal act began to feel the weight of what he had done. For the first time, alone, without the usual sense of power and protection of the uniform, he began to ask questions that he had so far deliberately avoided. In his solitude, surrounded by the walls of his own apartment, the policeman felt an anxiety that grew inside him, filling the silence in which he hid from the fury of society. His thoughts became heavy and rambling. The images of that fateful evening came back to him again and again, like intrusive shadows that he could not shake off. He saw the eyes of the man cradling the dead dog, his face full of pain and helplessness, the tears that ran down his cheeks, and now, with the fury of the crowd left outside and his pride beginning to crack at the seams, the officers felt the picture evoke an unpleasant sense of guilt in him. In private conversations with few friends, he tried several times to justify his behavior as he had done before. He began with phrases full of echoes of his usual defenses. "I was sure he was a danger," or "What if the dog had attacked me?" But his words sounded increasingly unconvincing, even to himself. At some point, looking into the eyes of his friends, he began to notice that his excuses sounded pathetic, as if he were not trying to defend the truth, but only to avoid responsibility. In a conversation with a close comrade who had known him for years, he was silent for the first time when he heard a quiet but direct question, "Do you really think you were right?" These words threw him off balance, and he frowned, not knowing what to answer. He had never doubted his rightness before, never thought about the consequences of his actions, or that anyone might question his authority. But now he couldn't answer. A vague but persistent feeling grew inside him that it had been wrong, that his action had been not only cruel but unjustified. That's where his internal struggle began. Every time he saw the news or heard about the protests, he found it harder and harder to shrug off his own thoughts. Society demanded truth and justice, and though he was afraid to admit even to himself that he had done wrong, the thought of remorse became more and more inescapable. He began to feel his own loneliness. His colleagues and friends had withdrawn. His superiors were no longer openly defending him, and he was left with the only honest answer he feared. In the silence of his apartment, he wondered more and more if he should admit his mistake, but fear held him back. He was afraid that if he confessed, he would lose everything: his reputation, his job, the respect of the few people who were still on his side. He panicked at the mere thought of a public confession, but the guilt continued to weigh on him like a heavy stone on his soul. The policeman, previously confident that he could avoid criticism and responsibility, began to feel pressure even among his closest people. Those who had previously supported him and looked up to him with respect were now waiting for explanations, and this demand became more and more insistent every day. Family and friends who had previously been proud of his service began to openly show their displeasure, expecting him to explain and justify his actions. It seemed to him that the criticism coming from those closest to him was more painful and heavy than any condemnation from strangers. His parents were the first to speak. His father, who had supported his son all his life and respected his profession, began to look at him more and more often, with a hard look full of judgment and bitterness. During the family dinner, Where previously there had been mutual understanding and a warm atmosphere, now there was tension. Finally, his father could not stand it any longer and asked the question that the policeman dreaded most of all. "How could you do that? Do you realize how it looks from the outside? People think you overstepped your authority. Aren't you disgusted with yourself?" Those words hit him deeper than he was willing to admit. The policeman tried to explain himself, but his arguments sounded increasingly unconvincing, and he noticed that even his mother, who had always defended him, lowered her eyes when he spoke. There was a quiet pain and disappointment in her gaze, as if her son was now seen as a completely different person, someone she didn't know. That realization tore at him, but he stubbornly avoided admitting guilt, continuing to repeat words that had long since lost their meaning to him. Over time, his friends, who usually treated him with respect and trust, began to ask him difficult questions. One of his closest friends, who had known him since childhood, once invited him for a cup of coffee, and instead of the usual friendly conversation, a heavy silence hung in the air. The policeman felt that his friend was about to say something important and painful, and his fears were justified. "You know," he began slowly, looking him straight in the eye, "I always thought you served the law for justice. But what happened? This is beyond anything I've ever known about you. Do you really think you did the right thing? Or was it just a flash? How can you sleep well after all this?" The friend's words were painful and unaccustomed. The policeman tried to justify himself by saying that he was forced to act, but his friend interrupted him. "Stop it. We both know that's not true. You did it because you felt powerful, because you could. Do you have any regrets?" The policeman was silent, not knowing what to say. These words, spoken by someone close to him, shattered his usual justification. He couldn't brush off these questions, couldn't hide behind the protection of his uniform, because in front of him sat not just a critic or a reporter, but a man who had known him all his life. Someone who had seen his weaknesses and his accomplishments, now saw a dark side that was impossible to escape. The pressure was getting worse by the day. Even his sister, who had always supported him, had written him a long message asking if he had thought about the consequences of his actions, how it had affected the people who saw him as a threat rather than a protector. Her words were calm but perceptive, and behind them was a bitterness of disappointment that hit harder than any outside accusations. His reputation was slowly eroding among his family and friends, and each new conversation with his loved ones only intensified his internal struggle. He could feel the ring of condemnation tightening around him, and he realized he couldn't justify himself with the words he used to use. The silence that had helped him avoid responsibility was now losing its power. His loved ones were demanding a real confession and remorse, and he felt it was the only way to regain their trust if it was still possible. After weeks filled with internal struggles and mounting pressure from his loved ones, the policeman realized that he could no longer hide from the truth. The words of his parents, friends, and especially his mother's disappointed look pressed harder and harder on his conscience, breaking down the wall of excuses he had tried to build for so long. All this time, he lived in fear of judgment, afraid to admit he'd done wrong, but now he realized that the only way to ease that guilt was to confess what he'd done. As he entered the police station building, the policeman felt his hands shaking faintly. The corridors he used to walk through with confidence and a sense of authority now seemed alien and cold. The familiar glances of his colleagues, the brief nods and formal greetings, left a heavy feeling behind. He realized that many here already judged him, maybe even despised him for what had happened. But now he was ready. He had to meet his superiors face to face and tell them what was really tormenting him. When he entered his superior's office, he looked at him with an icy calm, his face serious and focused. The policeman understood that his superiors were already tired of the public pressure and the fact that the situation was out of control, and he expected to be criticized and insisted on protecting the department's reputation. But instead of the usual excuses, he began to speak, feeling the heaviness in his chest cracking with each word. "Sir," he began, his voice quieter and calmer than he had expected, "I didn't come here to defend myself. In fact, I have a confession to make. What I did was a mistake, a huge mistake." The chief seemed stunned by his words. He frowned, leaning forward slightly, as if he couldn't believe he was hearing this from a man he knew to be a tough and principled officer. "I do not justify my actions," the policeman continued. lowering his gaze. I was not acting as an officer of the law at that moment. I let my emotions get the best of me, let bias and maybe even anger drive my actions. I realize now that I caused terrible pain to a man who had done nothing to deserve it. He stopped to catch his breath, feeling the weight of the confession on his shoulders. Now that the words of repentance had been spoken, he was afraid, but for the first time, it was not of judgment, but of finally seeing himself as others had seen him. He was naked before his superior, as if the confession had revealed his weaknesses and mistakes. I thought I was doing the right thing, that I was defending the law, but now I realize it wasn't upholding the law. I abused my power, and I can't shake this guilt. It's haunted me every day, every night since I realized what I'd done. I realized that words may not mean much, but I want to apologize, sincerely. The chief looked at him for a long time, thinking hard. He saw before him not a uniformed officer, but a man depressed by his own mistakes, and realizing for the first time the gravity of his actions. His face was stern, but behind that expression, there was thoughtfulness and perhaps even understanding. He realized that he was not just an officer, but a man who had tried to stifle his guilt, but in the end could not hide from it. Recognition is only the first step, the boss finally said. Do you realize that you will have to take responsibility, and that this confession must be made not only to me, but also to society? The policeman nodded, lowering his gaze. He knew that this confession was only the beginning, and that he had a hard road ahead of him to earn forgiveness, if it was possible at all. But in that moment, in front of his superior and admitting the truth, he felt, for the first time in a long time, that he had made the right move. The policeman had been preparing for this day for a long time, knowing that the meeting with the dog owner would be the most difficult part of his journey to repentance. He knew that even a sincere apology would not erase the pain and bitterness caused by his act, but the guilt kept him going, and he knew he owed it to the man before whom he had done the unforgivable. As he entered the small meeting room, where the dog's owner and his family were waiting for him, the policeman felt his heart clench with tension. The man sat across from him, his gaze full of grief and contempt. His relatives were standing next to him, their faces impenetrable, but their gazes were full of pain, ready to unleash on the policeman everything that had accumulated since that tragic day. The policeman sighed, lowered his gaze and spoke, his voice low, barely restrained. I came here to apologize, he began, and his voice trembled. I realized that my actions were unreasonable, that I overstepped my authority. I have caused you pain that cannot be forgiven. I can't turn back the clock, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. He looked at the man, hoping to see the slightest sign of softening, but met only a cold, hard stare. The man, who had lost not just a pet, but a loyal friend, sighed heavily, as if holding back anger, before answering. Kitty, his voice was quiet, but filled with bitterness and indignation. Do you have any idea what sorry means to us? You took a family member away from us, my friend, for no good reason. Because he was there for me. Because I'm not like you. You didn't do it because he was a threat. You did it because you saw me as a threat. The policeman was silent, unable to object. There were no words in his mind that could justify what he had done, or convince the man that it was a mistake and not a deliberate cruelty. The man continued, his voice louder, revealing the rage and resentment that had not subsided since that tragic evening. Are you saying you're sorry? Did you just start thinking about it now? When people took to the streets, where was your pity when you saw me sobbing, hugging my dead friend? You looked at us with cold hatred, with arrogance, as if I had no right to be hurt, because to you, I was always guilty just because of who I was. The man's relatives sitting next to him also expressed indignation, every look filled with alienation and underlying rage. One of them, an elderly woman, sighed and, barely holding back tears, added, "You don't understand what it means to see your son suffer, to see him lose his most precious possessions, all because someone decided he was dangerous. You saw him as a threat, simply because you're used to looking at people like him with contempt, and nothing you can say will bring us back our peace." The policeman felt shame rising inside him, mixed with a sense of helplessness. He had come here hoping that at least a sincere apology would assuage their pain, but he had faced a wave of just anger and disappointment. He knew that these people saw him not just as the culprit, but as the personification of a system that had treated them with prejudice and humiliation for so long. His words meant nothing to them. They were just sounds, empty and powerless in the face of deep loss and injustice. "I realize you won't accept my apology," he said quietly, lowering his head, "and I don't expect forgiveness. But believe me, I'll never forget what I did, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't go without consequences." "We don't want your promises," the man replied, his voice full of contempt. "You're part of the problem, not the solution. Forgiveness can't be bought with words. You'd better remember that pain and loss can't be redeemed by apologies." The policeman left the meeting feeling that his apology had not only been rejected, but had reinforced the gulf that now lay between him and his men. Desolation reigned in his soul. He realized that the scars left by his action were too deep to be healed by words. A huge number of journalists, media representatives, activists, and citizens gathered for the press conference, which had been talked about a few days before it took place. Outraged by the police officer's act and his long silence, the hall was crowded. Cameras were directed at the policeman, who was soon to make a public statement. Everyone was waiting to hear how he would explain his act, and most importantly, what he would say to those who had lost trust in the police after the tragic incident. The atmosphere was tense. This was his only public appearance, his only chance to make things right in the eyes of the public. When the policeman came to the podium, there was a look of excitement on his face, but he tried to remain calm. Dressed in civilian clothes, he looked different than usual. His posture was not as confident and unyielding as before, and there was something in his eyes that could be described as fear and inner struggle. The crowd frowned, and he began to speak, his voice trembling, but he made no attempt to hide it. "First of all, I want to say that I deeply regret my actions. I realize that this may not sound sincere enough to those who have suffered because of my action. But believe me, this is not just a formality. What I did was unforgivable." He paused, struggling to choose his words, feeling the hard stares of those who were not ready to forgive and forget. He realized that everyone here saw him as the very person who had taken the life of an innocent creature and left its owner in despair and grief. "I made a mistake," he continued in a quieter voice. "It was not just a mistake, but a terrible act that violated every principle by which I was obliged to live as a policeman. I had used my power, I acted cruelly, and now I have to live with that for the rest of my life." At these words, a muffled murmur ran through the hall. Some whispered, some looked at him with undisguised contempt. The policeman, gathering all his will, went on, trying to explain his feelings. "I realized that no uniform, no status gave me the right to take a life or humiliate those who trusted me with their safety. I let bias and pride rule me in that moment, and believe me, that decision has haunted me every night since." He sincerely hoped that his words would reach those who felt pain and anger at his actions, but the stares directed at him from the audience were cold and wary. The policeman felt his words drowning in this sea of judgment, as if his every gesture and word had been taken apart, scrutinized and rejected. "I know that many people saw my action as an act of racism and cruelty, and I dare not deny that my actions were biased and unfair. I did not have the right to judge a person just because of their appearance, how they look, or where they are. I understood that, but I let my stereotypes and faulty judgments take over. For that, I apologize." His voice trembled, and he knew that many sitting before him would not accept his words. He could see the disbelief and underlying anger in the faces of those present, as if every word was seen not as sincere remorse, but as an attempt to save himself. He realized that words were no more than a small part of what he had to do to atone for his guilt, and that forgiveness, if it was possible at all, would require a long and difficult effort. "I'm willing to suffer the consequences," he added, trying to look straight into the hall, into the eyes of those who were now his harshest judges. "I realize that people may not accept my apology, but I will do my best to change the system, to prove that mistakes like mine don't have to be the norm. I recognize my guilt, and am willing to cooperate with those who seek change." When his speech was over, there was no applause in the hall. There was an oppressive silence, and someone shouted from the back rows, "You think words will fix everything? Actions speak louder." The policeman remained standing behind the podium, Realizing that the trust broken that day could not be repaired with new words, he left the room feeling that his remorse was only the first step on the long road to real responsibility. After the press conference, where the policeman tried to express his remorse, the public buzz and social media was filled with discussions, comments and arguments. Reactions to his apology were contradictory. While some saw his words as a sign of genuine remorse, most remained skeptical and incredulous. For many, his confession and remorse seemed belated, forced by the pressure of public outrage and protest. Those who supported his apology believed that even the worst act deserves a chance for remorse and correction. They emphasized that it is important to give the person a chance to realize their mistakes and try to correct them. Some commentators wrote, "If we demand change and justice, we need to recognize attempts at remorse as well. This man has realized what he has done, and we need to give him the opportunity to redeem himself. The important thing is that he has admitted his mistake and is willing to take responsibility. We can't fix society if we don't give people a chance to change." However, much of the public remained adamant that the late apology was not credible. Skeptics saw in his words only an attempt to save his own reputation, to avoid public condemnation, and to avoid harsher consequences. They pointed out that had it not been for the huge public outcry, the policeman would never have admitted his mistake and apologized. Their views were direct and uncompromising. It's too late to say sorry when people have already demanded your accountability. If it wasn't for the thousands of people on the streets, he wouldn't have even thought of apologizing. It is not remorse, but fear of being punished. Such a person should not wear a uniform and should never be among those who are called to protect others. People shared their own stories of encounters with biased police officers, distrust of the system, and how these apologies can't put a damper on the anger buildup over the years. One user wrote, "These words are nothing more than empty apologies. When you have caused such pain, no apology will make you worthy of the form and trust of society again." Some representatives of social movements and human rights organizations made official statements, emphasizing that repentance is an important step, but it must be accompanied by real action. Otherwise, it has no value. The activists insisted that society needs not only apologies, but also guarantees that such cases will not happen again, and that the system will be reformed. There were calls not only to punish the police officers, but also to create mechanisms that would prevent biased behavior on the part of law enforcement officers. Repentance alone is not enough. They said, "We want to see real change. If the system allows one person to act with such cruelty and bias, then the problem is deeper than just one act." Hashtags like apology is not enough and words is not sufficient appeared on social media, attracting thousands of comments. People demanded that the apology not remain empty words but lead to real change. Calls for his sacking, for severe punishment and police reforms were louder than attempts to justify his act with remorse. The video of the press conference went viral on the internet, but the comments beneath it reflected deep distrust and irritation. Many users left messages under the video, such as, "We don't need his words. We need justice and assurance that the men in uniform will not abuse their power again. Let his remorse be a lesson, but this should not be the end. We will not rest until people like this are fired and the system is purged of racism." Thus, the public was divided. Some tried to see in his words sincerity and a chance for change, while others, tired of systemic cruelty and bias, considered his words a tactical move devoid of real guilt and regret. Under pressure from public outrage and sustained protests, the police announced the launch of an internal investigation. The aim was not only to look into the actions of a particular police officers whose behavior had caused a mass outcry, but also to identify systemic problems of racist behavior and bias among officers. The announcement was a response to public demands for reform and led to a promise to review the entire structure and principles of policing. The investigation was led by a special commission consisting of representatives of law enforcement agencies, human rights organizations, and independent experts. They were to examine not only the behavior of a particular officers, but also the prevalence of bias and abuse of power in the department. The commission began by analyzing complaints and appeals that had been filed against police officers in recent years. Numerous cases were identified in which suspects or detainees, especially minorities, complained of excessive aggression, unjustified use of force, and racist insults. The investigation revealed that such cases were often overlooked or dealt with superficially. Many of them never resulted in serious consequences for employees, allowing systemic problems to flourish and remain out of sight of management and the public. Now, under intense public scrutiny, management was forced to not only promise stringent measures, but to ensure that they were implemented transparently. Active discussions began on plans for reforms that could prevent such incidents in the future. The first proposed reform was the introduction of mandatory anti-discrimination and de-escalation courses for all police officers. These courses were planned to help officers better understand how to avoid bias and aggressive behavior in situations that require self-control and respect for human rights. The police also promised that such trainings would become regular and mandatory for every officers, regardless of rank. Another important part of the reforms was the initiative to introduce independent oversight commissions that would deal with complaints against the police. These commissions were to be composed of independent experts, members of the public, and human rights defenders, which would guarantee a fair and impartial review of each complaint. The public and human rights organizations welcomed this proposal, considering it an important step towards restoring trust between the police and the public. To ensure transparency, the authorities also proposed to introduce a system of regular monitoring and auditing of officers' behavior. As part of this reform, it was planned to track complaints, use of force incidents, and police interactions with minorities in order to identify trends and prevent potential violations at an early stage. This data was to be made publicly available, allowing the public to monitor changes and evaluate the effectiveness of measures taken. In addition, questions were raised about psychological testing of employees. Proposals were made to conduct regular psychological tests for stress tolerance and tendency to aggressive behavior. It was felt that this would help to identify staff who might pose a potential threat to society and who might not be able to cope with the pressures of their work. The management also considered a proposal to make it mandatory for all officers who work on the streets and regularly interact with citizens to wear badge cameras. The video recordings from the cameras would provide important evidence in controversial situations, helping to avoid unfounded accusations, as well as to protect the rights of citizens in case of abuse of authority by the police. Promises of reforms, however, were met with a degree of skepticism. The public remembered that similar measures had been proposed before, but had not always resulted in real change. Human rights organizations and activists insisted that promises should be fully implemented and demanded specific deadlines and accountability. At each stage of reform, it was also proposed to create a special body that would be solely responsible for controlling the implementation of reforms and monitoring the effectiveness of changes. While the investigation was ongoing, the authorities assured that they would do everything possible to prevent racism and abuse of power among police officers. But the public made it clear that they were ready to monitor the reforms and would not allow the investigation to become a mere formality. People were waiting for real change that would restore trust and protect everyone, regardless of their background or appearance. After the incident and the protests that followed, public perceptions of the police and their role in society began to change rapidly. People were increasingly thinking not only about the specific case, but also about the deeper problem, the systemic racism and brutality that pervades law enforcement. This event seemed to be the last straw for many, awakening broader questions in society about justice, equality, and human rights. Discussions on television, social media, and forums increasingly focused on the systemic causes of such incidents. People began to actively share personal stories of encounters with biased police officers and stories of discrimination and violence experienced because of stereotypes and unfounded suspicions. Each story reinforced the collective realization that the problem is much deeper than it seems, and that it is not limited to one police officers or even one department. It permeates the very structure of the law enforcement system. Public figures and human rights activists once again spoke about the need for legislative reforms. Contrary to past attempts to solve the problem, at the level of individual departments. People now demanded deeper and more fundamental changes at the level of legislation. The public realized that without legal accountability for bias and without a rigid framework to control police behavior, such incidents would be repeated. Systemic racism is not just the bias of a single police officers. It is a culture of impunity which gives government officials the confidence that their actions will go without consequences. Human rights activists said at rallies and on social media. The change in perception was also reflected in the political agenda. Politicians, who had previously avoided controversial topics, now increasingly expressed the need for radical change. Discussions revolved around the introduction of new laws that would criminalize biased and abusive behavior on the part of the police. Among the proposals were the mandatory introduction of badge cameras that must remain on at all times when interacting with citizens, increased oversight of protocols and procedures, mandatory anti-bias courses, and psychological tests for officers on a regular basis. Recognizing that the police should serve the interests of all citizens, not just certain groups, community leaders and activists called for new standards of accountability. Initiative groups began to form, demanding the establishment of independent oversight commissions to oversee investigations into cases of police brutality and bias. The change in public perception also changed the general attitude of people. Many people who had previously believed that such problems were only a concern for certain groups began to realize that lack of police accountability was a threat to everyone. People realized that equality and protection from bias is not an issue for individuals, but a right for everyone, regardless of background, appearance, or social status. The incident of police brutality and bias has left a deep mark on society, forcing everyone from citizens to the authorities to rethink their attitude towards law enforcement agencies and to reflect on the role of the police in society. What began as a tragic case of abuse of power has grown into a broad movement for justice, equality, and transparency in policing. This situation has not just sparked outrage, but has become a powerful catalyst for social change, reminding people of the need to protect the rights of every citizen, regardless of their background, appearance, or social status. Society has learned several important lessons from this case. First, it has once again realized how dangerous it is for those who wield power to lack accountability. When law enforcement officials are unchecked and unaccountable for their actions, the very essence of security and equality is jeopardized. The case showed that without real accountability mechanisms and strict penalties for abuses of power, any promise of security becomes empty words. Second, the incident emphasized the importance of transparency and accessibility of information about police actions. Many realize that knowledge is power and that the public must have the right to monitor the work of those who protect them in order to prevent incidents of bias and brutality. Demands for the introduction of body cameras, independent oversight commissions, and mandatory reporting of use of force incidents are no longer just a request, but a necessity. The incident also helped the public to realize how dangerous systemic racism and bias can be when they are subtly woven into structures designed to protect people. People began to demand mandatory anti-bias courses and strict hiring procedures to prevent bias and racism from creeping into everyday police work. As a result of this case, support for independent oversight bodies that could objectively evaluate police officers without depending on the internal system also increased. In the political sphere, discussion of systemic racism and bias also increased, and many politicians began to raise the issue of law enforcement reform. Numerous amendments to laws concerning police powers and accountability for exceeding them have been proposed, bringing public attention to the need to reform the entire structure and principles of policing. This case sparked public discussions that police officers should serve all citizens, not just a certain part of society. Finally, people realized that defending justice and equality requires efforts not only from individual human rights defenders, but also from every member of society. Bringing people together in protests and discussion showed that only collective action can bring about real change. Citizens realized that their voices and actions have power that can not only stop injustice, but also prevent it in the future. The incident reminded the community that the struggle for justice requires constant engagement, that we cannot remain indifferent to injustice if we want to build a society based on equality and respect for all. This case was not only a lesson for the police, but also for everyone who saw that equality and justice are values worth fighting for. The story showed that the abuse of power is unacceptable and that society can, and sometimes must, demand change to build a fairer world. The public was determined not to let this story remain just a tragic episode. It was an example that change is possible if people stay together, if they stand up for justice, equality, and respect for everyone. Friends, this story raises important questions, and we are really interested in your opinion. Write in the comments what you think about what happened. Have you experienced racism or bias yourself? It is important for us to hear from you, and your stories. Every comment is important to us, and we deeply appreciate each and every one of you. Support our channel by liking us if you care about justice and equality, and subscribe so you don't miss new videos. We wish you a good day and remind you that you are our main motivation to continue this work. Thank you for being with us.